You got no time to waste, but still you hesitate. Caught in a circle saying, I'll never leave this place.
Hey everyone, welcome to the Silicon Alley Podcast. I'm your host, William Glass, CEO and co-founder of Ostrich, and of course, your host of the Silicon Alley Podcast. Now, on the Silicon Alley Podcast, I talk to entrepreneurs and top performers to understand what it truly takes to grow and scale a business. You'll get actionable advice that you can apply in your own business and life. And today's episode is a very, very special episode of the Silicon Alley Podcast. It is the 53rd episode, meaning that for an entire lap around the sun, the Silicon Alley Podcast has been running week after week, airing every Friday morning like clockwork. So before we jump into the content for today's episode, it's important to tee up why this podcast exists in the first place. Silicon Alley came to be a platform to learn from and connect with other entrepreneurs, VCs, and top performers in their respective fields as a way to, one, entertain you, the audience, and two, selfishly for me to learn as well. And on the podcast, we also talk a little bit about personal finance. You notice that there's some questions at the end of every podcast that I make sure to hit that we don't normally talk about. And that ties into the second part of why this platform exists. And it's to document my own entrepreneurial journey, as well as Andrew Holiday and I, as we're building Ostrich, and sharing our own trials and tribulations of building a fintech company as first-time entrepreneurs. And our aim is to systemically change an entire industry. And so it's a pretty big task. And so that's why this podcast ties directly into that. And those are kind of the two levers of why this podcast exists. And if you haven't already, go to getostrich.com, make sure to sign up. We're going to have some big announcements as we get ready to launch here soon. So anyway, that's my one plug in terms of Ostrich. But with that in mind, the next two episodes, 53 and 54, will be focused on the lessons learned as producing this podcast, Silicon Alley as a podcast. And then the other is an update on Ostrich and the lessons that we've learned in the last, 6-7 months since the pandemic hit and how we've been able to build through that. And what a ride it has been so far, both Silicon Alley and Ostrich. And to commemorate this moment in time of being on the airwaves for a full year, I've got 10 nuggets of wisdom from podcasting that I've learned. 7 of them are lessons, things that you should take, whether you want to start your own podcast, you just enjoy podcasts, or you are ever asked to be a guest on a podcast. Please pay attention. And 3 failures that I've made. And at the end, I'm going to share some statistics about the podcast that I think you will enjoy. So let's dive into it. So the first lesson that I've learned on this podcasting journey is that talking is easy, podcasting is hard. It seems like everyone is starting a podcast these days. It's super easy to press record on your phone, iPad, your Apple Watch, whatever you use, devices, and plop the audio and video on YouTube and your favorite podcasting hosting platform, and boom, you're officially a podcaster. Congratulations. Welcome to the club. End of story, right? Not so fast. You're not quite ready to be the next Joe Rogan with a $150 million Spotify deal. Not to say that you can't, but talking is easy, podcasting is hard. And so when you think about putting together an episode, you're probably like, yeah, you know what? I'll just, press play and we'll go. I'll get my best friend on the line, or maybe I'll just go solo and stream of conscience, and whatever comes out of my mouth, I'm sure it's going to be gold. People are going to love this. I mean, who wouldn't want to listen to me talk, right? Well, the talking part is easy. Let's say you knock that part out of the park, right? You get a great successful episode, but what goes into recording is just one piece of it, right? The talking part is easy, getting an idea, something interesting to talk about. The hard part is really connecting with your audience, right? Finding the valuable stories, nuggets, knowledge bombs from your guests, if you're having guests, or 2, really putting together a structured episode that leaves your audience with something to take away and to go implement in their own life, something that they can actionably take, or that gets them thinking in a way that they weren't before they listened to the episode. I think the other piece is, getting the right guests on your episode, right? I could probably go out on the street and just ask, anyone that passes by, and probably 9 out of 10 would be like, yeah, you know what? I'm sure I'd love to be on a podcast, because it's kind of cool. Like, who doesn't want to be interviewed and talk about themselves or talk about their stories or comment on something? whatever their favorite TV show or whatever the podcast focus is. So that's one piece, but finding guests that are really going to resonate with your audience is crucial, and something that I'm still continuing to learn. Another fun piece, right? The talking is easy, the podcasting is hard. That seems really simple, is that pretty much everyone forgets to press record at some point in time. And there's nothing like realizing after you had one of the best interviews that you've ever done or recorded the best podcast to look up and play back the audio or video file and realize it's silent. There's just silence. And so that is a common error of making sure that you get that right. And so along with that, in the post-production vein, right? Compiling your episode, getting it all together, it takes a lot of work. It takes a lot of work to consistently put out something of quality. And I know that I'm guilty of not always hitting that mark, right? If you listen back to some of the episodes for this podcast, you'll hear my audio not being very great at times, or a guest audio not being great, or Zoom giving out right in the middle of the best part of a story or a nice little knowledge nugget. And, it is what it is. So again, talking is easy, podcasting is hard. So the second lesson is that the caliber of your guest is not in their follower count, right? It's not about how famous your guest is. It's a common misconception, and I had it coming into the podcasting game, is that getting a super high profile guest will make your podcast take off like rocket fuel. Just get Gary Vee, or, let me get George Clooney on there talking about building Casamigos tequila and selling it for over $1 billion, his house in Lake Como, and all these other things. And my podcast is it's going to take off. It unfortunately does not work that way. So don't get me wrong. Definitely you should be shooting for big names, big guests, but recognize that one episode where Clooney does his best Brad Pitt impression will be an outlier and a mere flash in the pan. And so what I found actually counterbalancing this is that some of the unknown names or folks that are not super famous, but have deep personal connections, both professionally and in their personal lives with their networks, actually tend to be some of the best guests. They're relatable and people care about what they say. Their stories haven't been told, or if they have, not very frequently, and people want to listen to them, right? Two of my best performing episodes are Yotam Hadass's episode, which is Creating a Transformative Remote Culture, and Randall Ledette's episode, Why is My Brain Thinking This Way? And what's crazy is that both Yotam and Randall's first ever podcast was this one, the one that they recorded, Silicon Alley. And they were fantastic guests. So the caliber of your guest, again, is not in their follower count. And so I keep stressing this, that, the fame is not the important part, but it is recognizing that big names do open doors to other contacts and other signals, to other folks out there that are looking to be on podcasts, that yours should be one that they pay attention to. And so what I've noticed is having some big names on the podcast in the VC world and the tech world, I've now got inbound interest from higher caliber and profile people, right? And so people use that as a barometer to decide if a podcast is worthy or not, because whether you realize it or not, there's not really a great way to tell which podcasts are huge and which ones aren't, right? There's no real analytics, no big dashboard. There's not something that's super, super clear as to what the biggest podcasts are out there. And so people look for these types of cues so that they can figure out which podcasts are the ones worth paying attention to, both from an audience perspective, but also from a guest perspective. So in conclusion, go after that exclusive with Vladimir Putin and Oprah, but realize that that one episode with a big name won't guarantee success. You can look at some of the other names out there. Just ask Quibi or WeWork. They are not doing so hot. Number 3. Now, the third lesson that I've learned so far is that curiosity is as important as preparation. It might even be more important than preparation. And so I do want to stress that preparing for an interview with a guest is absolutely crucial. You shouldn't go in there and not even know their name and say, yeah, tell me about yourself, and just start asking questions. That would be a terrible episode to listen to, though it might be fun to listen to the first couple of minutes to watch you crash and burn, but not in the way that you want it to be entertaining. And so preparation is a huge component and very important to get an idea of who your guest is, their accomplishments, as well as any potentially funny or valuable anecdotes to make sure that you bring up. But at the end of the day, curiosity and asking good follow-up questions is the key. That is what will make or break your podcast long-term, right? From the guests that I've had on the podcast that have been on other podcasts, one of the common annoyances that I hear from them, and I'll toot my own horn here for a second, is that they like my style because they can tell I was paying attention, that I was asking follow-up questions. I wasn't completely trying to change the subject because I wrote down what I think is the best question ever, and it's choppy and doesn't fit. And that curiosity is what allows for really deep and insightful conversations. Now, do I do it all the time, 100, as great as I could? Absolutely not. It's something that I'm continuing to work on. But when I prepare for an episode, I'll put together a long list of things, topics, questions that I might ask. But we would maybe cover 20, 25% of those. And of that 20 or 25%, some of them are the same questions that I ask everyone at the end when it comes to personal finance, right? And so it's all about listening, paying attention, and diving deep. And so part of that comes from being prepared so that you know where you might want to lead a conversation and what fits in or what you can prompt. But really the most important part is actually listening to what your guest or your co-person, if you have a co-host, is actually saying. To kind of put a little extra exclamation point on this point, have you personally ever had the experience at a job interview or maybe even a date perhaps where it's only after you've said goodnight to your date or you've hung up the phone with the hiring manager that you think of like 20 things that you wish you could have said or you should have said? You're like, man, that's how I should have answered that question. Well, that happens on podcasts too. That happens to your guests and to the guests that are on podcasts. And so the curiosity component allows you to dig deeper so that people can clarify, or pausing and repeating what the guests have just said gives them that time to get that spark. And one of my favorite things to hear is, well, let me just add, because typically after someone says, let me just add, you're about to get a big knowledge bomb and kind of a summation of where their thought process was. And so again, as I said, point number 3, curiosity is as important as preparation. So the fourth lesson that I've learned on this year-long journey of Silicon Alley is that the best guests cross-promote, right? It makes me so excited when I see someone months after an episode is aired, sharing a quote card, sharing the video again, sharing something from the podcast, tagging me. It shows that they got value out of it too, and that they want to continue to share their own wisdom and things that came out of the podcast with their audience. And that really excites me. And so on the other end of the spectrum is that as a host, nothing peeves me more than when a guest doesn't help share promote. We just spent an hour together, at least. We hopefully both spent time prepping. On the back end, I know I spent more time editing, preparing the podcast to go out, writing all of the content that goes around it, and then cutting up all the marketing clips, finding the little knowledge bombs and nuggets to share. And then when some people don't respond to an email, or a guest just doesn't respond to tags on social media, they don't reshare, they don't even like posts that they're tagged in, it's just radio silence. It's rude. It hurts. And now, again, I understand that everyone uses social media differently, and some people don't use social media. And again, life happens. There's things that come up circumstances wise. So I don't take it personally when a guest doesn't share cross promote, but that doesn't mean I don't take notice. And one of the other reasons why it's so important to cross promote is that, and this goes for any form of media, right? Regularly cross promoting your host, whoever that platform is that is sharing your story, will take notice. They will thank you, and they will potentially invite you back in the future, or even better, recommend you to others in their network when they're looking for similar guests or stories that meet that profile, and you will reap the rewards. So be known as the best podcast guest ever. And again, you could reap those rewards for years, decades, maybe even decades to come, because podcasts are often evergreen, right? Silicon Alley podcasts are evergreen for the most part. And so be the best guest be in that top tier and cross promote. Now, the fifth lesson that I've learned is that you can't fix it in post-production. As much as you'd like to, you can't fix it in post-production. So if you are new to audio and video creation, one thing when it comes to bad audio is that you really can't do much after it's been recorded, right? And what I mean by that is not to say that you can't cut pieces out, right? Like ums, ahs, or someone accidentally, calls someone out that they're like, oh, I shouldn't have done that, or, I want to cut that piece out. That's easy. That's simple. But what's almost impossible to fix is that your mic is turned so low that, a dog whistle that only dogs can hear sounds like a bullhorn, right? Or you're outside in the middle of a windstorm and all you hear is, And so no amount of post-production can truly fix those, right? You can kind of put a Band-Aid on it, but it definitely can't fully be fixed. And so first off, I'm guilty of this myself. I've been thinking that I could solve volume issues or little ruffles in post-production, but unfortunately, it just doesn't work that way. One thing to clarify is you don't have to be in a soundproof studio and all that stuff, but get a decent microphone, a $20 microphone off Amazon or Walmart or somewhere like that, and just that plugs into your laptop or phone. Trust me, it's worth that small investment, because if you plan on being guests on other podcasts or other media outlets, like the audio is absolutely crucial, and you want people to get all the way through your story. You don't want them to listen to the first 5 minutes and be like, it's just too hard to hear this person and cut it off. And so for hosts and other people that are producing content, as annoying as it is to reschedule when you both have shown up for an interview, it's better to do that than putting out crappy audio. And again, I've made this mistake before, so I'm speaking from experience. And this also goes if the Wi-Fi is so bad or it's storming outside, and the audience will thank you and the quality of your content will be better. So push it back until you can resolve the issue. As frustrating as it is, it's definitely worth it because you can't fix it in post-production. Now, the sixth lesson that I've learned is that you don't have to air every interview. And I'm going to let that one sink in. Just because you sat down and talked to someone that you thought you wanted on the podcast and you recorded it doesn't mean you have to air it. And this one could be controversial, but I know that I have had one guest in particular that was so horrendous, and more so from their professionalism, and then it translated into the quality of their audio and other things, that I just chose not to air the episode. Because one, it's not fair to you, the audience. It's not fair to share that, right? And so at one point, there's some networking apps out there for podcasters to connect with other potential guests and things like that of people that have interesting stories and that are willing to share. And I was on one of those, and I've had mixed results. I've gotten some great people through that. So definitely you can find them, but there's also a lot of duds. So you've got to sift through those. And what you'll also find on those are people that just have a goal of being on 100, 200, 300 podcasts, and that's all that they want to do. And that's kind of what happened. So there's this one guy who showed up 20 minutes late to our meeting. And first off, I emailed him at 5 minutes. And then at 15, I was like, all right, I've got to drop off here. And after about 20 minutes, he emailed me and said, hey, sorry, I'm ready. Let's record. And I pushed it back because I want to be able to dive deep and hit all of the really important topics. And this guy had a really good background on paper, right? Like looked like it was going to be a really great conversation. And I didn't want to shortchange him and his stories and the knowledge that he could share. And two, the audience, that's why you listen, is for those knowledge bombs. If I don't have the time to really dive deep into those and we're just doing the surface level stuff, it's not exciting. And so we pushed it back. And when we reschedule this time, he's just 10 minutes late. So here we go. We're on strike 2. And I'm getting pretty upset at this point. But we go through the interview and it just wasn't good. Like, I don't know. I don't really know how to explain it, but his spiel was super over rehearsed and lame and just left a bad taste in my mouth. And again, this might be because of the professionalism piece, but it was also a little bit of the quality. And so I chose not to air that. And you know what? He'll never know. You want to know why he'll never know? Because he's never once followed up with me. He is just trying to be on as many podcasts as possible. And I am quite certain that he has no idea who I am at this point. Yikes, he missed out on a great opportunity to have a great conversation and kind of blew it. So my point is that you don't have to air every interview, and being unprofessional is a surefire way to get your interview canned and put in purgatory. And now the last piece of wisdom that I have on this before I get into failures over the last year is commit, commit, commit. When we first start something new or try something out for the first time, we typically have a lot of excitement. We have a lot of energy. We're super excited to go do this new thing, try this new thing. I have this great idea. I'm going to go execute it. It's going to be awesome. It's going to be the best thing ever. The challenge comes days, weeks, months, even years later when that excitement has worn off. Now all of a sudden, it's not exciting to go record a podcast or go do that thing that you were super excited about. It's a chore. Man, I've got to do this. And this is the challenge when it comes to creating media specifically. It's constantly creating a quality product, but also consistently creating that product, right? How disappointing would it be if, you've got ABC or one of these big networks that has your favorite show on the air, just all of a sudden be like, nah, I'm good. We decided not to put up an episode, even though they've been teasing the next episode. They're like, we just didn't feel like it. Right? You'd lose your audience. People would be upset. And so when I started Silicon Alley, I committed to it fully. And what I mean by committing fully is I made a promise to myself and you, the audience, that there will be a new episode every Friday. And while that might seem daunting to commit like that, to put out a podcast episode every week forever, but that's the mindset you need to have to ensure that you don't skip a week, or you can rationalize putting an episode out because, I'm not going to put it out because my audience hasn't grown as fast. No one's going to really know. And I can promise you that there will be days that you don't want to record, or you don't want to edit, or you forgot to plan ahead and now have to stay up late to get something out, or you're traveling, and these roadblocks will happen. But if you commit ahead of time, then you'll be prepared when those feelings do come up. And whether you have no listeners or the show takes off like a rocket ship, give yourself a set time period where you're not allowed to quit. After the 6-month, year, 5-year mark, whatever that timeline is, whatever you set, you can reassess then. But until then, commit, commit, commit. Now, I want to get into some of my failures, right? And every episode I fail in some capacity, whether it's missing a key detail of someone's story, mispronouncing a name, spelling something wrong. And if you follow Silicon Alley on social media, I'm sure you've spotted a few of those over the years. I think I'm a lot better at that, but every now and then there'll be something that slips through the cracks, or, again, forgetting to tag your guests in posts. These things happen. And so I'd like to share some of my biggest failures this past year. By no means is it an exhaustive or the entire list, but some of the key ones that stand out that I would like to share with you. The first one is promotion. And so, the last kind of lesson that I shared was commit, commit, commit. And so I did that. Every Friday morning, there was an episode of Silicon Alley podcast out. Now, if you were listening, if you weren't subscribed and you were just on social media or things like that, you might not have realized that. And I read somewhere that you should spend between 5x to 10x the amount of time and energy promoting your work as it takes you to create it. And I fail miserably at this time and time again. And so the idea is, you don't want to, spend years producing, this master work, and then, you spend 2 minutes posting it once to Twitter and then that's it. Right. So it makes sense that you should spend more time getting it out and promoting it. And so again, like I said, I committed to putting out a new episode weekly, but I didn't commit to promoting that episode consistently. And this is where I fell short. In my asset library, where I have all the marketing materials, I have like 20 to 25 times the amount of content created and prepared than you have ever seen in terms of like quote cards on social media and things like that, video clips on YouTube, whatever it is. I've got way more in the backlogs than you've ever seen. And the way that my workflow works, it leaves me with a lot of those assets, which I'm grateful for. But again, if you follow Silicon Alley on social media, you haven't seen much of it. Again, I fail at this time and time again. There's been weeks. And then at one point, there was even like over a month where I went by without putting anything out except for maybe an Instagram story. And it's hard to continue to build momentum when you're not doing the proper promotion. So, if I had 1 million subscribers, then maybe it really wouldn't matter. But as an early stage quote startup podcast that's growing, it's not a good look. And if I look back at my own analytics in terms of listenership, I can look back specifically and be like, oh, well, here's a couple of weeks where I didn't go with promoting anything, or here's the month that went by and I didn't put anything out. And so part of my problem and the thing to learn from my failures that I get exhausted creating and producing the episode, that the marketing falls flat. And so that's not what you want to do. And so moving forward, that's one of my goals, is to get better and turn that failure into a lesson learned and a success for the platform and the podcast. And so the second big failure that I've had over this past year is quality control. It's just been super inconsistent at times. And I've made this mistake in multiple ways. And when I first started Silicon Alley, I only recorded audio. So I don't know if you remember that, if you've been listening that long, but there was only audio. And I figured, hey, it's a podcast. Most people are audio first, and I don't want to have to edit both audio and video. That sounds like a lot of extra work and super miserable. And so when it first came to quality issues, a lot of it had to do with microphones not working, audio dropping off. If you listen to the very first 2 episodes with guests that I recorded, it's episode 3 and 4 with Corey Johnston and Wes Harrington. In Corey's episode, we each had a microphone, but his ended up not working. We lost the audio. We recorded them on separate laptops and the audio file got destroyed. And so I had to somehow try to tone up his voice and tone mine down on the same microphone, even though it was pointed and sitting in front of me. And that one was really rough. And then in that 4th episode with Wes Harrington, I only had one microphone, and I knew that going into it. The issue was that we ended up recording on a granite kitchen island in an all-tiled, there was no soft surfaces at all, and it echoed like crazy. And like, I can still hear the reverberation in my head right now. And, that is something that you definitely shouldn't do. And so as time has passed, I've mostly figured out the audio issues. And then around episode like maybe 14 or 15, I started recording video as well and began repurposing both the audio and the video. And mostly I was editing the audio and then just kind of like slapping stuff on the end of the video to put it up on YouTube. And that worked okay, except often it was too dark on my screen or face. The lighting was terrible. The angle wasn't good. For me, I've been in multiple places recording. And so I had inconsistent backgrounds. And, I took feedback from guests. I had some guests that were willing to share. And, I asked guests, hey, do you have any feedback for me as a host? And that meant elevating my camera, getting better light, things like that. So that way you weren't looking up my nose, and, that's not exciting. I still make these mistakes though. If you listen to some of the most recent episodes, there's been some issues with guest microphones or the internet going out. And while I wish I had done a better job of quality control, I've learned a lot of the things that I can and how to improve the quality. But yeah, that's a big failure that I know that I need to continue to work on. And then the third big failure is proper outreach to my ideal or the guests that are like on my like most want to talk to list, right? And I haven't done as great of a job in terms of reaching out to people that are 2, 3, 4 degrees outside of my network. Because there's some entrepreneurs that I'd love to talk to that I know would be great for the podcast. And I've just failed to reach out to some of those folks. And I think early on, it was a lack of confidence and wanting to build more of an audience and kind of figure out my own flow and perfect more of my own abilities as a host that kept me from going after some of those like really top tier guests. And unfortunately, that has kind of translated into a habit of not doing a ton of outreach to some of those people. And it's something that I wish to improve moving forward. On the bright side, I've had some really fantastic guests, referrals from friends, acquaintances, and I've just got a great network of entrepreneurs around me. So I'm super excited with the folks that I've had on the podcast, but and that inbound stuff has helped keep the pipeline full. But definitely something that moving forward is really important to that I need to do, and a failure that I've had with this podcast. And so to wrap up this episode, I want to talk about the numbers behind the podcast. And I think numbers are really fun and exciting. And these are focused on the guests and the people that come on to share their stories, which I'm super, super grateful to for all the time that they've spent in opening up. In total, I've had 44 guests on the podcast over these last 53 episodes. Out of those 44, 17 of them, Silicon Alley was their first time being on a podcast, which means that they had a platform for the first time to tell their stories and share their knowledge. And that's really exciting to me, because that means that as a listener of the Silicon Alley podcast, you heard stories of entrepreneurs, top performers for the first time that you couldn't find anywhere else. It's exclusive content. 40 of the guests that I've had are entrepreneurs. 13 of the guests were people of color. 10 hailed from overseas. 8 were female. 5 were venture capitalists. And 4 were not entrepreneurs at all. And outside of those guests, I've advised 6 others on how to start their own podcasts and media projects. And I believe 4 of the 6 are live now. And there's a couple that are in the pipeline, which is super exciting to see. But the number one most important statistic is you. Yes, there's only one of you. And I'm grateful that you choose to share your time and your headspace and energy with me on the Silicon Alley podcast. It means the world to me. And so I want to thank you so much for listening. And please share this podcast with others so that you have something to talk about besides what's on the news, right? Your friends want a better conversation than what's on the news. So please, please share, help grow. And thank you so much for being a listener. In addition, I haven't done this before, but I'm really excited. Please reach out to me at william@financialglass.com. That's my email for the podcast specifically. I'd love to hear your thoughts. And if you have any questions or comments, I'd be happy to answer those either as a segment on the podcast or privately one-to-one. Thank you. Thank you for being a listener. And I hope you have the best day ever. Thank you, and get after it.
You got no time to waste, but still you hesitate. Caught in a circle